August 13, 1985, Tape 1, Side 1. This is Sonia Raiziss speaking. I am recording a paper especially written by Laura Writing Jackson for the Poetry Archive of the Library of Congress. By the original arrangement between her and the Poetry Office, she was to make this recording herself to precede recorded readings from her poems. A physical condition interfering with sustained speaking prevents this. However, she still plans to record some readings of poems. I am the editor of the magazine Chelsea, which has published much of her work, and I'm a friend of long attachment to Mrs. Jackson. She has asked me to replace her for the recording of this special paper, the Poetry Office approving because of the unusual circumstances. Reading for the Library of Congress. Quite long ago, I was invited by Robert Penn Warren, in the name of the Library of Congress, to come to Washington to read from my poems for a recording of the reading. A rather long time before then, I had renounced poetry after 2 decades of loving concentration on the practice of it. I declined the invitation, wanting any public presenting of my poems after my renouncing of poetry to be accompanied by a reference to that fact, suitable in its substance to the occasion. I had not yet succeeded in formulating to my sense of the fully adequate the view of poetry I had come to have that led to my renouncing of it. Not until early in the 60s did I feel able to provide the definitive account of my decision that I judged its seriousness to require of me. The seriousness of my decision was not of a funerary order. It derived from my seriousness about poetry and being a poet, which was related for me to the solution I understood poetry to offer to the problem of our using words in a way that affected distinct presentation of experiences of consciousness felt by us to exemplify essential qualities of the life experience of human beings as minds. I took and take this understanding of poetry seen as a long-sustained activity endowed with this function and conceived of as capable of fulfilling it, to correspond with the traditional place that poetry has had among the historically certified human importances. By the time I entered into the continuity course of poetry, its historic impressiveness, emblematic of the urgency felt by human beings to give eloquent report of all that is humanly experienceable, had begun to weaken. It wore the old cloak of acknowledgement of human identity as an intimately active involvement of the human state in an embracing universal reality. But in the new century, concern with poetry was shifting further and further towards a different conception of its function and importance. It was gradually acquiring the character of a place for free presentation of experiences of self-preoccupied consciousness, felt to exemplify the nature of the individual life experience of human beings as uniquely particular personal entities. The world or universe of traditional poetic thought gradually receded into a background of literarily metaphoric myth. The property of distinctness as the natural objective of fully expressive report of human experience as having a natural universal scope disappeared from the prescriptive expectation of what poetry might provide. The verbal character of poetry, poetic diction, changed in intent from that of precision of phrasing and linguistic excellence in the entire substance of poetic argument to effort for the mark of individuality of poetic style. Eccentricity of expression became the substitute for originality in poetic diction, and instability in standards of the linguistically fitting, the way of life in the 20th century world of professional poetic activity. The pattern of human experience is one of uniquely universal scope, not personally or biologically or otherwise an idiosyncratic, particularized experience disappeared from the historically verified equipment of sensibility that had, until our time, marked the poet and the poetic function. But its disappearance was for quite long invisible, lost to view in the sweeping disappearance of the property of distinctness and poetic word use that converted 20th century poetry into a field of personalistic bravado, the words serving private functions assigned to poetry, not the general human ideals that had been embodied in the linguistic and moral constitution of poetry. It was just that property of distinctness in word use, and just that pattern of human experience as the universal, accessible to human sensibility, that I made the basis of my commitment to poetry as a form of realization in human beings of speaking presence of mind to the whole existence compass of being. The mood of 20th century engagement in poetry became a mood of daring to use the occasion of poetic utterance which had been understood in sustained commitment to a fixed conception of poetry as a kind of speaking reserved to urgencies of thought and feeling. Utterance needs above the level of private triviality, petty commonplaceness, for verbal improvisation for the sake of the satisfaction it might afford as intellectual adventure, emotional pastime. This daring became so elaborate and diverse, the private trivialities and petty commonplaces so weightily substantial, that the scales of measurement of the poetically urgent lost applicability. Anything and everything was legitimate poetic subject matter, and nothing was necessarily an essential or fundamental element or principle of engagement in poetic composition or comprehensive concern with poetry. The field of poetic writing expanded into one of democratic release to liberties of enlargement of the importance of private sensation, personally individualized problems of experience. It also contracted concurrently as a field of elevation of the concerns of human thought and feeling. That is, it became a variable of private spirituality. The poetic realm of the ideal was pluralized into whatever mirrored the individual poet's sense of individual higher need. The factor of spiritual elevatedness in the poetic temper no longer a common human mark of aspiration. Inwardly and outwardly, poetry became in the 20th century a changeling, a new literary form that continued to be given the name of poetry, but grew emptier and emptier in the century's course of the animating impulses of human aspiration, of which poetry had been the lifted-up voice intended to redeem human utterance from its surrenders to the demands of the impatient, greedy minutes of practical time, practical speaking, ordinary speech. The special voice of poetry was flattened into extinction by the construing of poets of themselves as, each, an autonomous poetic voice. In the critical language, the lexicon of literary terms of the century, the criterion of authenticity applied to the work of a particular poet has come to be a poise of self-confidence in his individual conception of what poetry is, ought to be, or can be made to be. The attributability to him of a voice, a poetic voice, all his own. I have used the masculine gender in referring to the poet of characteristically 20th century temperament, one who conforms to the new dogma of poetry as a speech realm of personal demarcation, where the poet makes bold to be the presiding voice, inventor in charge of the particular kind of poetic objective, matching the spiritual appetite of the particular poet self, because I have found that the century change nullified the traditional humanly universalized figure of the poet, of masculine identity by historic presumption. There ceased to be the ideal type of human sensibility that poetry stipulated as the ideal level of human experience. The figure of poet that issued on the stage of 20th century literary and human change was the individual male human being liberated from the moral and spiritual compunctions typifying the traditional poetic ideal of transcended sexually specialized identity. The model of 20th century poet personality early stabilized itself as the male spokesman of the human state, daring to probe the content of human individuality as the reality displacing the mystery of the human state itself, and that of the mystery of a universal reality presumed to envelop it. The literary clamor of the new poetry of human individuality represented in speaking postures of new, self-emphasizing, male-natured human identity caught numbers of the contingent of women drawn to venture in the chances of success in the new poetry in a net of self-emphasizing, female-natured human identity. This semblance of new opportunity provided them with no more than imprisonment in a delusion of literary, psychological, and social liberation from the cultural bounds of the old poetry. As poets, the women writers of the new poetry have achieved no more than imitations of the male-voiced exemplifiers of it in female-voiced exemplifications of the purportedly all-human realism of the new poetry. The male-female liberalistic ideology of the new poetry is a conspiracy of willful confusion imposed on the production site of 20th century poetry by all who place their poet identity under the protection of this ideology. The male conspirator affects an all-human allegiance that is but a presenting of male-naturedness as identical with honesty. The female conspirator canvasses femaleness as a new, humanistically realistic ground in the new poetry, committing the absurdity of killing off the transcendence of female-naturedness to a unitary, all-human-naturedness that has an instinctive, ever-potential immediacy in the personal constitution of women. Present-day understanding of the idea of poetry, its history and relation to the idea of the human being as fulfilling an ideal lovingly evoked in the human form of being, is heavily encumbered and obstructed by the ideological confusion of new sexualistic influences that have infiltrated themselves into the centuries' laboratories of literary theory and critical dogma. But the systems themselves of new prescriptions of what poetry is, which severed its connections with historic human identity and connected it with a philosophy of self-created individuality, vaguely scientific, vaguely political, definitively nothing other than spiritually nihilistic, rising from Nietzschean death of poetry pyres to Phoenix new forms of poetic vitality, are the crux of the disaster of acquisition of manifold spurious identities that befell the ghostly remains of poetry. I feel a need of touching on the theses of critical argument that were widely circulated in the first half of the century to scare off assaults upon the poetic new by proving it the only possible living successor to an unresurrectable old. A ferment of preoccupation with a need felt to replace old forms and uses of human powers of mind and sensibility with new ones marked the consolidation of the new numbered century date into a time structure rearing itself up as a world of change. The change manifested itself in a widespread sense of human ineffectuality that was not allowed, however, to plumb itself with the depth rods of despair, but was doctored with nostrums based on new, complexity-abbreviating conceptions of what constituted the human effectual. The old regimen of intellectually intricate philosophic speculation and the old morally intricate religious regimen of emotional disciplines were supplanted by new philosophies of science, new sciences of philosophy. The pace of intellectual activity was quickened to curtail the dilatory extravagances with which the old rationality was now charged. Problems of the life of personal identity, of character, and the life of human identity, of association, were relieved of subjection to old patterns of distinction between good and evil, truth and falseness, and transferred to the care of new simplified rationalities of distinction based on psychobiological interpretations of human nature and human behavior. Previously important principles of thought were stripped from the processes of thought. Meaning values previously of organic presence in the word-conscious elements of these processes were reduced to the fictional conveniences of a new kind of human mind, keyed to change, uncertainty, a universal environment no more than a coherence of incoherencies. Thus came it about that everywhere in the thought centers of human life, where the air of the 20th century new touched down, old familiars of human consciousness either underwent redefinition or expulsion into the void that had been thought of as a universe, an all-containing vessel of meaning. Locales of the new in literature and art, the world over, became compulsively busy with the devising of theories that made the nothingness of the table rase of the new the rationale, or a magical irrationality of effectual methods of literary or artistic functioning under 20th century conditions of change. In 20th century poetic radicalism, Gallic and American theory was preoccupied with identifying the new in poetry as time-compelled change in its linguistic constitution. Gallic poetic radicalism tended to treat the words of poetry as entities different by the nature of their use from the words of general linguistic use. While the emphasis here was on the physical attributes of word makeup, the theoretical concern was with a sensuous artistry of utterance. Germanic philosophic scientism and general European psychoanalytical moral scientism contributed to the breakdown in all 20th century quarters of the old conception of poetry as integrating language, the speaking human being, the all-attendant universe of being, in a coherence of healing non-partiteness. But the Gallic version of the poetic new was a unique theatricality. The American version of the poetic new was also marked by emphasis on the physicalities of utterance and by random influence intrusions into poetic theory from both European and American versions of the 20th century scientific intellectual new. Indeed, the American redefinition of poetry and the Gallic and the importance they gave to the physical effects and potencies injectable into it had a bridge of critical sympathy between them in the theatricality that Edgar Allan Poe popularized as indispensable rhetorical strategy in poetic composition. But what emerged as the dominant tendency in the new in American 20th century poetic theory and practice was neither to outright revolutionary overthrow of traditional principles of poetic intellectuality, nor to resort to devices of theatric novelty as an escape route from the underlying promptings to revolutionary stands. The American poetic new early resolved itself into dedication to a politics of personalism. Literarily, linguistically, intellectually, psychologically, poetry emerged as a scene of exploration of the possibilities of success of the individual human being with himself in an absolute, indistinguishably physical and spiritual detachment from the public worlds of nature and human sociality. That is, American rescue work was performed upon the remains of poetry in 20th century literary life that gave it a semblance of vigorous survival in exercises in privacies of verbally daring self-experiment. The poet of the American new way of poet being did not wage war against old ways of conceiving the privileges and limits of the personality of the poet in his fulfilling of the poet role. He acted under the authority of a declaration of new poet independence and of the constitution of a new united state of poetic freedom. Poetry was now the realm of the illimitable open spaces of the universes of private personality. The gender reference I use here is apposite. Poet self-identification became automatically personally individualized in the new customs of poetic behavior and automatically also concretely male for general practical inference. The female counterpart to this development, though comprising novelties of experiment in poetic behavior, was a shadowy image of it, of no substance itself as something new in poetic theory and practice. The force of new programmatic purposefulness was confined to concentrated in the male-gendered focal points of poetry propaganda. The names of Pound, Eliot, and Williams resound in the corridors of 20th century poetry-centered literary criticisms as hauntingly echoic of a profoundly influential view of past poetic theory, principle, practice. Other poet names of American national identity are associatively intoned in this music of attribution to the new century as an instant antiquity ground that brought forth a new poetry in full bloom at birth with the maturities of a tradition all its infant own. Poet names of French national identity figure with solemn ring in the myth of poetry's having been redeemed from an extinct history by the acquisition of a new 20th century historicity, and honors of hymnal mention are visited upon poets of other identity location as pioneers in the rewriting of the history of poetry, the fashioning of a new genesis for poetry, to rid minds of the new times of superstitious notions about poetry inflicted on them by the genesis of the old literary regime. Understanding of the relation of my poetic work and of myself as poet and mind actively concerned with the historic fact of poetry to the peculiarities of 20th century literary experimental play with the fact, reflecting and reflected in the experimental play with the fact of the human state of being that became the century's obsessive, general, all-round interest, requires some specific evocation of the century scene that was its temporal, but not its historical background. My being a poet and the spirit of my devotion to the fact of poetry did not have their generation in the spirit of revolutionary experimentalism that pledged itself to the reinvention of poetry and of the human being himself, herself, according as the new prognosis of the individual as universe might prove or not prove adaptable to the still old differences between him and her. I did not choose the work of poet to change the nature of poetry or the nature of myself as a being possessed of that distributive intelligence that calls itself human. Misascriptions peculiar to critical and personal commentary on my poetic work and my character as a poet derive all from a reading of 20th century literary history in which the identity of poetry and that of the poet have been altered beyond any containment within the norms of aspiration, the bricks of human and linguistic potentiality with which the edifice poetry was built. There is no edifice now. The poet is no longer, by a ritualistic commitment, mixedly literary and spiritual, member of a special community of the faithful, ministering to the promise, sheltered by the edifice for the sustenance of human hope through the weather changes of time on time. I've singled out 3 American poets as main proponents and example setters of what should be done to and with poetry to accommodate it to new 20th century ideas about poetry, human life, everything. One of these, Eliot, found a need of bracing his self-confidence as a poet of the new order of culturally, political, intellectual daring with credentials of climatically British literary professionalism. Pound, whose revolutionary daring had nothing in it of an inner melancholy diffidence towards the dignities and glories of the superseded poetic old, tore into the resources of the general history of poetry as into a museum of artistries, become the property of poets of the new order, trophies of their victory over the old order, freely theirs for the uses of their originality. Williams, as a theoretician of 20th century revolutionary doctrine and practice, clung to home ground. He defined his principle of stylistic, linguistic, thematic innovation in terms of structure. But this is not a principle of radical architectonic scrupulosity in poetic composition. Williams' structure is a counter-discipline to the properties of diction and of content that were implicit in the critically literate traditional conception of what was good poetry, poetry written in the English language. Williams meant a poetry of plain speech and subject matter, a defiantly American poetry. The identification in a new, exclusive, intellectual aristocracy. The change in the driving reasons of poets for concern with poetry in the 20th century had its start in the general trend in modern ideas towards substitution of individuality of being as the unit of human identity for the universal measure of the human presence in existence that has served as a truth mark on all the idea systems presented for human acceptance. The American contribution to the accommodation of poetry to the system of ideas that made the particular personal I, being seen as an isolatedly existent power of self, the central reality in the problems of consciousness and knowledge, was in all its numerous component poet and poet-critic parts unreservedly on the side of an all-round success for poetry, for poets, in the intellectually and philosophically revolutionized politics of human thought, purposes, affairs, with which the 20th century human world busies itself. There was less of the specialistic, culturally, literarily, critically, in American experimentation in a new identity for poetry than in any other quarter of 20th century poetic change-making. The Americans dared to experiment where others experimented in daring, with the result that in other quarters of 20th century rewriting of the story of poetry, the emotional basis of courage for the risks of poet being, under the new conditions of evaluation, was much more compromised by self-protective native mannerisms, advertising the element of daring in the new poet behavior to be autochthonously spontaneous. Thus, vanity of national, linguistically, historically, and culturally distinct identity has come to mark the literary posture and personal tone of English poets of 20th century change in ideas about poetry and poet being. The moral support of self-assurance that is an important element of English strength of character, admixed along the British literary course of things with 20th century bravados of male-tongued and male-brained liberties-taking with the solemnities of human fact, has become the literarily officialized virtue of British-bred poetic innovation. The vanity element in other national poetries of the 20th century is more quixotic. These are not so tightly consolidated into monuments to themselves as is the case with the British poetry of the era of experiment. The vanity element in the American poetry of this era is more fragmentary, lightweight. The initial spirit of daring here was free of fear. No shadow of risk of loss hung over the vision of possible success. There seemed to be nothing to lose. The only possible something was the chance of gain. At the least, the American version of 20th century consciousness of a crisis in the historic human sense of an imperishable value of truth, affecting the important status of poetry and of human existence itself, was a consciousness of an emergency calling for some immediate practical action. A busyness of individualistic diversity of experimentation and how to be a poet under the new order of ideas about poetry kept the American scene lively-looking, loose-strung, vaguely a scene of hope. My own behavior as a poet in the environment of early 20th century questioning on the importances had no element in it of forced response to sudden apprehension of a state of human circumstances of unignorable seriousness. I came to have the kind of behavior as a poet that my poems, from early to late in my life as a poet, manifest from an internal sense of my relation to the fact of human existence and the fact of the existence of language and poetry within an all-encompassing existence fact. My initial acquaintance with these facts was not filtered through impressions imposed on my mind's young knowledge appetencies by the new experimental thinking and writing of early 20th century times. That my encounter with these facts was personally direct, not generated by special emotional or mental influences, was owed in part to my being by nature stimulated in thought more by inwardly arising impulses than forces of external suggestion. Side 2. My ways of mind and feeling were also affected by the limits of intellectual concern in a household in which socialistic ideas were the exemplary stuff, the moral standards of the serious, as they were rather old-fashioned ideas, idealistically associated with good literature and philosophic thought of respectable scholarly status. They tended to be, on the whole, in my young life, patrons of freedom, of values determination, and protectors from erratic, new intellectualist propaganda, literary, philosophical, or other, than the reverse. And so my commitment to poetry was open-mindedly general, free from any bias of sectarian revolutionary poetry politics. It had no iron pinnings in the English poetic traditions, and no flair of journalistic or sentimental New World or New Era Americanisms distinguished it, or literary period fashionableness. It had for the entire length of my poet being, a sustained ring of practical intent, but of concern with poetry and engagement in it as an activity of purposeful language employment aimed at successes of new, broad human significance, not of new verbal dramatizing of human nature as a phenomenon of self-possessed, self-determining, self-referent individual being. The spirit of my commitment to poetry, as the energies of purposefulness developed in it, was revivalist, not revolutionary. The growing intensity of my devotion to it as a sphere of activity was related to my sense of a deficiency in the human beings of the world of immediate life of consciousness, of primary elements of the experience of being humanly alive. It was not related to a literary critical sense of a deficiency in the utility of poetry, question of its pertinence to the problem of self-respect, self-valuing, seen as faced by the individual human being after an ultimate dissolution of various unities devised by rational ingenuity in past time as antidote to confusion and uncertainty in human self-understanding. I was innocent of special purposes in choosing poetry as a work path, and I never lost that innocence. But I never, so long as I labored as a poet, broke with the general purpose to which I had understood my commitment to poetry committed me. This was the general human purpose I saw infused in the existence of poetry with more practical earnestness and sincerity than in any of the other forms of human spiritual exertion. My purpose was to uncover more than had been revealed, crucial parts of what had not yet been revealed by poetry of that purpose. Poetry has carried forward earliest human consciousness of the impulsion in human consciousness towards expansion of consciousness. The elementary love of knowledge of the human mind early made a home for itself in poetry, with vision of attainment to a human wholeness of being, a partnering occupant of the space of language's inner properties of truth that poetry took into proprietary charge. The taint of pride in poetry's creed of virtue was the least corruptive of virtue, among the creeds of virtue by which men published laws of life matching the versions of virtue they chose as honor-earning ones to live by. Poetry has had in its domestic identification of itself with the truth processes internally concentrated in words, a moral counterpoise to the pride and spiritual aspiration that kept the heights of philosophic and religious visions of success of the human lost in speculative mist or tumbling ever into face ready hands for instant re-elevation. Poetry has had the advantage over all other forms of spiritually serious human self-commitment of uniting the spontaneous appreciation of the human mind, of the breadth of experience within reach of human consciousness, of the actuality being, with the practical capacity of human mind, vested in the harmony of its functional processes with those of its natural instrument, language. This advantage may be termed the appeal, the authenticity mark of sensibleness, a superiority of simplicity, where other creeds of virtue have armed themselves with powers of complexity of explanation and self-justification, simplicity overwhelming rhetorics of persuasion. So it happens that poetry has had, and has rightly had, the strength of a creed, of virtue or honor of mind, surpassing others as coming closest to the instinctive in human purposefulness, and especially so as to the inner human sense of what words are for, their simple truth potentiality within the external diversity of complex rhetorics of argument, and of the confusions of special private purpose word use of so-called plain or ordinary speech. I believe in its having had in it this strength and the merit of a sensible spirituality. The historical record shows it to have been more actively stimulative of the instinctive human love of knowledge and truth and the good than other moral and spiritual influences having assigned seats in human society. It has also happened that poetry came to be assigned a literary seat in society's academy of importances, and in consequence of this, poetry has suffered of a progressive dividedness between its spiritual nature and its nature as a feature of the varying cultural dispensations that human societies has visited them upon themselves on their way to seemingly endless change. I believe that by the time I chose poetry as a guiding point of spiritual orientation, its essential nature and identity as a creed of redemptive potency has become submerged in the ideas of imperative revolutionary change of an all-new new that flooded into the 20th century in chaotic overflow from 19th century repressed restiveness. Faint intuition of poetry's unique spiritual and linguistic credentials have survived only in rituals of critical rhetoric touched with the jargon of the philosophical, psychological, anthropological new. The character of my identification of my purpose as a devotee of poetry with a purpose inherent in poetry's nature was, from my beginnings as a poet, and remained altogether disparate from the conception generally governing the sense of their relationship to poetry of the practicing poets of the century. My concern with poetry was not attended by a literarily specialistic concern about poetry's course and fate in the immediate world of competing cultural officialities. My concern with poetry was in terms of direct concern with the special course and fate of human life to which poetry had maintained a historied standing as its most intimate spiritual mentor. The effect of my operating as a poet with this, by literary convention, unliterary concern, has been that while I made a strong impression as a poet figure in 20th century literary world contexts of poetic performance, my poetic work has been dealt with in these contexts, both before and continually after my renunciation of poetry, as extraneous to the main interest of those concerned with poetry, whether as poets or professional students of poetry, or in private, amateur, intellectual attachment to it. Robert Fitzgerald, reviewing the 1938 collection of my poems, described them as outstanding from all others in the self-consciously modern literary period for purity of poetic character, and as the most advanced and personal, by implication, as attaining to a new degree of the humanly successful utterance in the poetic use of words. Yet it is the very outstandingness of my poetic work, as poetic utterance of a remarkable directness and personally natural distinctness, that has caused it to become increasingly, in the century's advance, an outlaw from the regular ritualistic mentions, references, topics of study, indispensable choices for anthological treatment. I did not attempt to inject something poetically new into the idea of compositional procedures of poetry. I rejuvenated something poetically old, a serene offering of itself, of the human consciousness as having extension of personal presence and speaking witness to the entirety of the existent, a taking of all into loving knowledge care. No one before me, man or woman, had done what I did, and my respect-paying to it as a way of utterance by which step-by-step rightness of word might open human vision to a full prospect of successful human being, had shown how, in the scrutinies of poetic word workmanship, the principles of fulfillment of the human destiny of truth uncovering innocently revealed themselves, without breaking of locks, plundering of language for gems of poetic diction. What I did excited interest here and there, but it produced always more discomfort than comfort. Long before I renounced poetry, poetry had been remodeled into a field of literary composition in which all sorts of features of poetic style were employed without grounding in any general prompting of purpose identifiable as poetic by the internal sense of poetry as concerned with the unities of human nature as a unity of truth, the virtue of speakable being. Against my poetic writing there was, from its beginnings as a 20th century representation of the historically verified human actuality, poetry an ever-enlarging display of the uses to which the external mannerisms of poetic writing style could be put for the uses of platform exhibitions of virtuosity in dignifying the incoherencies of the modern vision of human life, nature, purpose as a self-universalizing principle of individuality with formal or formally informal vestures of poetic coherence. I have been asked by someone who, though professionally involved in the contemporary cultivation of poetry as an authorship activity, offering unlimited opportunities of personal literary success, a poem, the test of will and the right of the individual mind to be heard, and by more than itself, feels drawn in conscience to weigh my view of what has been happening in 20th century concern with poetry against the evidence of her experience. Is the preoccupation of poets now with performance and the special development of what has come to be called performance poetry explicable in the terms of my judgment of the status of poetry in 20th century human affairs? Yes, I judge that there has passed from presence in 20th century concern with poetry the core of problems of central, moral, and spiritual concern round which the armature of protective linguistic technology was built, the differentiated poetic statement as intended to hold good beyond the limits of particular speaking occasions. The sense of poetic statement was supposed to transcend its own particularity, to marry the precise and the universal. When universality disappeared as the presiding theme of human spiritual preoccupation, and in poetry and other creeds of virtue, individuality replaced it as the general logical principle of human reference, the language cares of poetic nicety became superficial solemnities, redeeming enfeebled inner human solemnity from its superficiality. Yes, I judge the character of 20th century poetic composition to have become increasingly, and to be now hardly not other than exclusively, that of personal performance, individual self-description or self-defining, as the procedure has been called with congratulatory implication, using the hand-me-downs of poetry's commitment to the theme of universality as its platform. Yes, I judge poetry to have lost its identity in exercises in unidentified spiritual vulgarity. I ought to point out that there was some riddance affected in my poetic work of a feature of poetry so deeply ingrained in it as to have gone altogether unnoted and presumably unnoticed. I refer to the intonations of man-pride that insistently abound in the dogged resolution with which the patterns of poetic movement are maintained from one line's end abruptness to a new line, as if this were part of the natural course of things poetic. But a general aura of masculinity has hung over poetry throughout its career as one of the major forms of spiritual testimony and practice. The ideal conception of the human being that is at the heart of poetry has pervasive reverberations in it of association of humanness with men as emblematic representations of it. Works of poetry until very recent time were almost solidly the work of men. the reason of virtue that poetry has left as an echo impress of its nature on the history of human achievement has undoubtedly an initial strong connection with the appeal to men's minds of the prompt, near-at-hand solace of relief to burdens of consciousness that poetic modes of utterance provide. The moral instincts speak themselves first in men's minds in the form of a sense of guilt. Poetry thus, as a creed of virtue, has answered for men to primitive aspects of their moral and spiritual needs, as well as serving them in the maturing of their sense of themselves as human beings. Women's nature as moral beings is not in laddered pieces. Women are more immediately timed than men, in their nature as women, to their human nature. There is more immediacy of the human in the responses of women to the calls of life, in the life of human beings, than in those of men. I touch here on such matters of broad human pertinence only to bring into view the necessary manifestations of them in the course of poetry's taking form and maintaining continuity of identity as an institution dear to the most urgent human affections. Features marking the persistence in poetic customs of composition of procedures following dictates of a male version of human sensitivity have had long presence in poetry with acceptance as the poetically natural. For the aura of masculinity that enwrapped the age-on-age offerings of poets won by its own treating of itself as an atmosphere of virtue, the name and credit for them of the humanly natural. My comments on the history, in the history of poetry, of a dominance of the problem to men that their humanity peculiarly makes for them, belong to no venture in men's studies activity to fill out blanks in women's studies maps of special fields of human history. I have never been troubled by the fact that poetry owed its coming into historical existence and perpetuation to the assiduous development of it by men, largely and especially as a plane of practical spirituality, a plane on which to elevate the language functions to powers of human expressiveness above the level of the physically convenient or temporally expedient of what is called ordinary speech. The pull of the externals of aliveness on man-nature is relentlessly commanding, and the internals of human nature in men can take on a force of counterpull, giving the internals an odd, quasi-natural character of external potency. Every creed of virtue, institution of spiritually motivated human practice, poetry, religious or philosophical commitments, the commitments of the loose aggregate of loosely spiritual commitments that generalize themselves as literature and the arts, has had this problem of the pull of the external, to which man-nature is peculiarly subject. Intertwined with the special form of spiritual concern, the creed made its individual own. Or the matter of the problem of a difficulty peculiar to the male human being, of reconciling his outward-directed male-naturedness and his inward-directed human-naturedness, is inevitably, inextricably present in every form of endeavor to solve the problem of the relationship of human beings as possessed of consciousness of universal breadth to the fact, the reality substance of the universe of experiences. A self-detaching propensity has a primitive force of suppression-resistant recurrence in male-natured human beings. It has been as if every creed of virtue, of a principle of universality as the inherent nature of human nature, has had to keep reconstituting itself against an eternal primitiveness in the male nature of human beings, an instinctive clinging to the disjunctive powers of physical individuality as against threat of annihilation in a contract of spiritual peace with human identity as putting the wars of individuality of being behind the truly lived human state. In my contenting myself with poetry as a field and creative work, I for long making it the center of my general writer's concern with the work of ordering thought into the truth forms into which it could be cast by humanly honest and linguistically honorable use of words, I did not evaluate poetry as any other than, more than, a field of work and a creed of best promise for the possibility of finding the way to true living of the human state. I read no fixed culmination of the linguistically and humanly possible in the past records of poetic achievement. There is evidence in my poems, as there is in all other writing of mine, both before and after my renouncing of poetry as the way, of my having an open-eyed awareness of all the frailties in the attitudes to one another of human beings and failures in their arrangements for associating with one another as such, and a wide-ranging perception of the still unresolved difficulty of comprehension that the difference between man-nature and woman-nature present to human beings in their still confused sense of themselves as divided in identity within the fold of human identity. I have long seen the separatist identity sense to which male human beings are instinctively inclined as the mainspring and model of preoccupation with individuality as essence of human identity, as, that is, the seat of delusion and self-delusion as to the nature of human nature, and latter-day philosophic dismissal of the idea that there is any essence quality in being human. I have long seen an intrinsic property of humanness in the way in which female human beings treat their human identity, which is as something in natural personal hold. But neither within nor outside the fold of poetry or poet being have I diverted my concerns into channels of linguistic or literarian assault on maleness trends in features or modes of literary composition. I have indicated here in a single reference to a settled feature in poems composition that I believe that I introduced trial of a tempering of line-ending necessities to necessities of continuity grace, such as operate automatically in prose writing without producing poetic prose effects or making musicality a solution of problems of poetic form. I believe that I effected generally in my writing of poems changes in poetic language climate from an overhanging aura of masculinity that I have identified as pervasively attendant on it to a spacious air of the all-human, issuing from the all-immediate fact of language. But I offer these suggestions as to differences from the old to be found in my poetic work as possibly helpful to an understanding of the very different differences existing between my poetic work as having some sort of new in it and the various examples and types of the poetic new recognized in the official critical catalogs as of pure 20th century pedigree. In my poetic work, in all my writing, in my thinking, findings, definitive courses of disposition and feeling and thought within and outside of the limits and reaches of writing, there has proved to be that which prompts responses of the extremeness of love or hate. There has been little response to what I present authorially or in personal address that is not at least love-like or hate-like in its trend. In between the extremes and response manifestations bordering on them, there has been little to nothing. Avoidance of commitment to response is not attributable, in the particular case of my poetic work, either to its being dismissible as a poetic old hat character or as not meeting in its new hat features the requirements of the 20th century poetic consciousness. What articulated dismissal of it there has been has not amounted to more than complaint of it as calling for efforts of understanding, discouraged by an initial suspicion that they would be unrewarded. Interest in poetry in the 20th century poems readership became centered increasingly in verbal experiment conducted for the enrichment of the expressiveness of poetic diction in the possibilities of linguistic play. This according with a taste for linguistic play stimulated in the general literary readership of the century by the verbalistic revelry of Joyce and others. There is much in my poems to interest readers disposed to pleasure-taking in enrichment of the expressiveness of poetic diction. But what I accomplished in my poems in the fortifying and expansion of the expressive powers of poetic diction was feat of linguistic work, not linguistic play. Play has been the 20th century cure-all for all the human uneasiness mounted up within the century's fences against life as an eternity. Word play in literature, as play with the visual media in art, acquired in this century primary intellectual authority. The linguistically serious became literarily outmoded. To be taken seriously by any literarily up-to-date readership, a work must reveal itself as a product of hard linguistic play work. My poems have over-tried the forbearance of a large number of those who classify themselves as lovers of poetry by the consistent dependence in them on word work, where literary reading has become so much lighter work through the time's lifting of the curse of linguistic seriousness from serious literature. Finally, to characterize the love-hate proclivities of response to my authorial presence in the century and to the personal reality of this presence in terms of my matured sense of their significance after long and varied experience of them, lasting even with multiplication into these immediate later days of mine. From the earliest in responses to my poetic work, there have been certain ones of a kind that, though rather mutely unparticular and rather vaguely general, belong on the very favorable side of critical judgment. I find myself able, from wealth of familiarity with such responses, to reduce the element of the laudatory extreme in this to a plain essence, natural and reasonable in sound. There is something right about this. Yet there is something inflammatory in effect in what strikes people as having something right about or in it. It excites compulsion to love, an emotion of dutiful love, but it can also excite resentment in which hate smolders. Extremes of the condemnatory in responses to my poetic work as to the entire authorial and personal quantity of my bearing my name have a ring of outraged objection to what is suspected to be possibly having something right about or in it, as to direct exposure to an unanticipated indignity of forced acceptance of something as having something right about or in it, because it obviously so does. Indeed, in the love response to my poetic work and the entirety bearing my name, I have found a potentiality of flare of impatience with, haste of inattentiveness towards, the loved something right. An intellectual policy of suspicion of the human intelligence as having something generically wrong about it or in it has prospered in our times. The more persuasive the impression made by works or acts of human intelligence of having something right about or in them, the more subject they are to a dictate as of human intelligence to look for something wrong about or in them. A general confusion now prevails in human minds as to comfort in the human state that makes accommodation to it as having itself something wrong about it, the key to an intelligent piety, faith in a something right about and in this something wrong as the given of existence. The stamp of a something right on my work has engulfed it and myself in this confusion, which has kept repeatedly obscuring or annihilating its and my messages of comfort in the midst of it. There could be much said on the perverse advantage to themselves that certain poets have derived from the injection into their work of echo effects of my something right, and on the perverse irresponsibility of critics in their excluding me from, or sometimes including me in, their strategy systems for positions of influence in literary world fields of power. But I have wanted here to dwell on central things. In my reading from my collected poems, I shall choose from the later ones as having more concentratedly present in them the concern central to the whole.